See this line of code. This is how they got in. I'm closing it now.
What if I told you that the person who holds the key to your survival is the one you've never even bothered to learn the name of? This is the unbelievable story of a man who ruled a city with an iron fist, only to lose it all in a heartbeat, and the woman in the simple maid's uniform who became his only hope. A woman who chose to be invisible. A man too powerful to ever look down, and 1 second of courage that changed the course of both their lives forever. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you will realize that genius doesn't always wear a suit and tie. Sometimes it's standing right in front of you, waiting to be seen. You'll understand why our greatest protectors often come from the places we least expect. This is a story of hidden brilliance, the sting of betrayal, and a love that bridged 2 completely different worlds. Welcome back. Before we get into the heart of this mystery, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever felt like someone was underestimating what you're truly capable of? I'd love to hear your story. You know, life has a funny way of stripping us of our pride when we think we're untouchable. Let me tell you about Choi Tae-Won. In the neon-lit streets of Seoul, his name was whispered with both respect and fear. He was the boss of an empire that blurred the lines between high-stakes corporate business and the dangerous shadows of the underworld. Tae-Won was a man of total control. You could see it in the way he carried himself, and in the dark ink of the dragon tattoo that wound its way up his neck, a silent warning of his past. His penthouse was a fortress of glass and steel, overlooking a city that he felt he owned. For years, he had operated in the dark, building a legacy of power that was finally about to go global through a massive international merger. He had the wealth, the influence, and a small army of men at his command. But on this particular night, the air in the penthouse felt cold. It was nearly midnight. Tae-Won sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his fingers pressed to his temples, staring at the high-tech monitors that lined his wall. He was waiting for the final confirmation of his merger. Then the screens flickered. A single red warning light blinked in the center of the main display. Then another. Then, the entire room bathed in a haunting red glow as alert after alert began to scream across the glass. His secret ledgers, the ones that could put him away for life, were being decrypted. His offshore accounts were being emptied. His entire digital kingdom was being dismantled by a ghost. Tae-Won clicked frantically, his face pale with disbelief. For the first time in his life, the Dragon of Seoul was helpless. He was watching his life's work vanish into thin air, and there wasn't a single person in his inner circle who could stop it. He didn't realize that the only person who could save him was already in the room, standing quietly in the shadows with a cleaning cloth in her hand. The silence in the penthouse was heavier than the darkness outside, broken only by the frantic, rhythmic clicking of a mouse that sounded like a heartbeat in distress. Choi Tae-Won, a man whose very name could freeze the blood of his enemies across Seoul, felt a cold sweat prickling at his hairline. On the wall of high-definition monitors, the world he had spent 15 years building, complex of shipping lanes, real estate holdings, and silent partnerships, was bleeding red. It wasn't just a glitch. It was a zero-day exploit, a digital ghost that had bypassed every firewall and encrypted guard dog his expensive security team had installed. One by one, his assets were turning into ghosts. The bank accounts in Zurich, locked. The cargo manifests for the Incheon docks, deleted. Even the smart locks on his own private elevator had engaged, sealing him inside his glass cage 40 stories above the pavement. Tae-Won's face, usually a mask of impenetrable calm, was contorted in a mixture of fury and genuine terror. He slammed his fist against the mahogany desk, the impact rattling the crystal glass of expensive whiskey he hadn't even had the chance to touch. For a man like him, power wasn't just about money. It was about the ledger, the digital record of every favor owed, every bribe paid, and every secret kept. And right now, he could see a progress bar on the center screen. Agonizing crawl as an unknown intruder began downloading the black book. If that file reached the authorities, his rivals in the rival gangs of Gangnam, his life wouldn't just be over, it would be erased. He reached for his encrypted phone to call his chief of security, but the screen stayed black. They had cut him off. He was the dragon of Seoul, yet in this moment, he felt like a trapped bird watching the hunter approach with a net. He leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers pressing so hard into his temples that his vision blurred. The red light from the monitors cast a demonic glow over the intricate dragon tattoo that peeked out from his collar, making the ink look as though it were writhing in the same agony he felt. He had always known that betrayal would come from the shadows, but he had expected a blade in an alley or a poison drink at a gala. He never expected to be defeated by a flickering screen and a series of error messages. The weight of his isolation began to crush him. He had spent his life pushing people away, treating subordinates as chess pieces and allies as temporary inconveniences. Now, in his hour of absolute need, there was no one to call, no one to trust. Then, a soft sound cut through the digital sirens of his mind, the faint, rhythmic squeak of a rubber-soled shoe on polished marble. Tae-Won froze. He hadn't heard the door, and the security system was supposedly locked down. His hand instinctively went to the drawer where he kept a silenced pistol, but he stopped when he saw a reflection in the darkened window. It wasn't a hitman. It wasn't the police. It was Kiara. She was standing near the edge of the desk, her posture as straight and composed as a soldier's, though she held nothing but a white microfiber cloth and a spray bottle of glass cleaner. Her black and white Maid uniform was crisp, hair pulled back into a neat, professional updo that left her expression clear and unreadable. For 2 years, she had a ghost in his house, someone who moved through his private life, without ever leaving a footprint. He had never asked where she was from or what she thought. To him, she was simply part of the furniture, as invisible as the air he breathed. "Sir," she said. Her voice was low, steady, and possessed a calm that felt alien in the middle of his chaos. "Not now, Kiara." Tae-Won snapped, his voice gravelly with stress. "Use the service stairs, if they still work. The building—" He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He was a king watching his crown melt, and he didn't want the help to witness his humiliation. He turned back to the screen, watching the progress bar hit %. "It's over," he whispered to himself, a rare admission of defeat. But Kiara didn't move. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the lines of code scrolling across the secondary monitor. She didn't look confused. She didn't look scared. She looked. "That's a morphic worm," she said quietly, her American accent cutting through his panic. "If you keep trying to bypass the kernel with your admin override, you're just giving it a map to your secondary backup. You're accelerating the wipe." Tae-Won's hand froze over the keyboard. He slowly turned his head, looking at the young woman he had ignored for 700 days. He saw the way she looked at the red warning screens, not with the wide-eyed wonder of a servant, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a professional. For the first time, he noticed the intelligent spark in her eyes, a sharp, piercing brilliance that he had been too arrogant to see. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kiara didn't answer immediately. She set the cleaning spray down on the $20 desk and stepped into the light of the monitors. "You have 30 seconds before the ledger begins its final upload to an external server in Macau. You can either keep wondering who I am, or you can get out of that chair and let me stop the bleed." In that moment, the hierarchy of the penthouse shifted. The billionaire, the dragon, he was just a man in a burning house. And the maid, she was the only one knew where the exit was. Tae-Won looked at the red screen, then back at Kiara's steady, confident hands. With a shaking breath, he pushed his chair back, yielding the seat of his power to the woman who had spent the last 2 years cleaning it. The fall of the dragon was complete, but as Kiara's fingers began to fly across the keys with a speed and precision he had never seen, a different kind of story was just beginning. The transition was so seamless it felt surreal. One moment, Kiara was the woman who polished the mahogany. The next, her hands moved across the mechanical keyboard with the rhythmic, percussive speed of a concert pianist. Tae-Won stood paralyzed behind her, his shadow cast long against the red-bathed walls of the penthouse. He watched the reflection of the scrolling code in her dark eyes that usually looked toward the floor in a show of professional deference, but were now sharp, predatory, and entirely focused. "You're using a decentralized firewall with a single point of failure at the gateway," she murmured, her voice stripped of the soft, polite lilt she used when asking if he wanted more tea. Now it was a voice of steel and precision. The attacker knew that. They didn't break in, they were invited. "This is an inside job, Mr. Choi." Someone gave them the master handshake. Tae-Won felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. And inside, his inner circle was composed of men he had bled with, men whose families he supported. To hear this silent observer diagnose his betrayal so casually was a second blow to his chest. "How can you be sure?" he managed to ask, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. "Because this specific exploit, the Ghost Protocol, was developed by a private security firm in Virginia 5 years ago," Kiara replied, never taking her eyes off the screen. "It's not sold on the dark web. It's commissioned. And the only way it works this fast is if the secondary authentication was disabled from a local terminal at least an hour ago." She began typing a string of commands that Tae-Won didn't recognize. The red screens began to flicker, turning a cautious amber. "I'm creating a localized loop," she explained. "I can't kick them out yet without triggering a scorched earth script that would wipe your hard drives. But I can make them think the download is continuing while I redirect the data packets into a dead-end server." Tae-Won leaned in, his chest nearly touching the back of the chair where she sat. He smelled the faint, clean scent of lemon polish and laundry detergent on her uniform, the humble smells of her daily labor clashing violently with the high-stakes digital warfare she was currently winning. He looked at her hands again. They were steady. His own were still shaking. "Who are you, Kiara?" he asked, the question finally getting out of him. "I looked at your file. You're from Atlanta. You had no high school records in the system. Your references were housekeeping in Busan." A small, sad smile touched her lips, though she didn't look back. "People see what they want to see, Mr. Choi. You wanted a maid who didn't speak much Korean and didn't ask questions. I needed a place where no one would look for a tactical analyst who knew too much about the wrong people. In a city of 10 million, the most powerful man's house is the best place to hide, as long as he thinks you're invisible." The amber light on the monitors suddenly turned a brilliant, steady green. The screaming sirens of the alert system died down, replaced by the low, comforting hum of a healthy network. Kiara exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of her 2 years of silence. She leaned back, her hands finally resting on the desk. But her posture remained bright and composed. "The lockout is lifted," she said, finally turning the chair to face him. "Your assets are frozen in place, not gone. But you have a window of about 6 hours before they realize the black book they're downloading is just 3 terabytes of corrupted system logs." Tae-Won truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the strength in her jaw and the deep, quiet intelligence in her gaze. He realized with a jolt of shame that he had treated a genius like a shadow, a master strategist like a servant. He was the boss of a legendary criminal organization, a man who prided himself on seeing through everyone. Yet he had been completely blind to the most remarkable person in his life. "You saved me," he said, the words feeling heavy in the quiet room. "Why? You could have let it happen. You could have walked out the service door and been free me forever." Kiara stood up, smoothing the fur apron, returning to the physical stature of a maid, even though the energy in the room had shifted forever. "Because I know what it's like to be betrayed by the people you trust most, Mr. Choi. And because I've spent 2 years watching you, you're a hard man, and you've done things that would make a person lose sleep. But I've also seen you send money to the widows of the men you lost. I've seen you sit in this chair until 4 in the morning trying to figure out how to go legitimate so your daughter doesn't have to grow up in the dark. She picked up her spray bottle and the microfiber cloth, stepping away from the glowing screens that now displayed his restored empire. I didn't save the mafia boss, she said softly, walking toward the door. I saved the man I think you're trying to become. Tae-Won watched her go, the silence of the penthouse no longer feeling like a tomb, but like a beginning. He looked at the empty chair where she had sat, realizing that his empire hadn't been saved by his gods, his lawyers, or his lieutenants. It had been saved by the woman who knew his secrets, not because she stole them, but because she was the only one who bothered to stay in the room while he was alone. The golden light of dawn began to creep over the Seoul skyline, but inside the penthouse, the air remained thick with the remnants of the night's desperation. Tae-Won stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghosting over the sea of lights that had almost become his headstone. Kiara had returned to the shadows of the kitchenette, the soft clinking of porcelain the only sign she hadn't vanished like a dream. He looked at the master key card resting on the edge of his desk, a small piece of plastic that held the digital lifeblood of his entire organization. To give it to her meant more than just technical access. It meant handing over the secrets of the families he protected, the locations of his safe houses, and the identity and who called him boss. If she was a plant, a deeper sleeper agent from a rival faction or a foreign government, this was the moment he would walk himself to the gallows. The sun is coming up, Mr. Choi, Kiara said, stepping back into the light. She wasn't holding a cleaning cloth this time. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable, but her adi. The morning shift at your headquarters starts in 2 hours. By then, the person who initiated that handshake will realize the data they stole is garbage. They'll try a hardware override. If they do that from inside your server room, I can't stop them from here. Not without the master key. Tae-Won turned, his gaze dropping to the tattoo on his neck. It was a mark of a world built on blood oaths and absolute, unquestioning loyalty. In his world, outsider was a threat by definition. His advisors would tell him to have her eliminated the moment the screens turned green, to bury the secret of his weakness, along with the woman who witnessed it. That was the way of the dragon. As he looked at Kiara, a woman who had spent 2 years seeing his humanity, while he had ignored hers, he realized the old ways were exactly what had led to this betrayal. His loyal lieutenants had seen a paycheck. This woman had seen a man trying to change. If I give you this, Tae-Won said, his voice low and vibrating with the weight of the decision, you will know things that even my shadow doesn't know. You will have the power to destroy me with a single keystroke. Why should I believe that a woman I've treated as a ghost for 2 years won't take her revenge now? Kiara didn't flinch. She took a step closer, the distance between the billionaire and the maid dissolving until they were simply 2 souls in a room. Because, Mr. Choi, I don't want your empire. I've seen the weight it on your shoulders every night when you think no one is looking. I'm not helping you to get a seat at your table. I'm helping you because you're the first person in a long time who made me feel like I could stop running. She reached out, not to take the key, but to gesture toward the screens. You have a choice. You can trust the people who call you boss, and wait for them to finish what they started tonight. Or you can trust the woman who has been cleaning up your messes literally and figuratively for 2 years. The silence stretched, agonizingly thin. Tae-Won thought of his daughter, sleeping in a secure location, and the legacy of violence he desperately wanted to shield her from. He thought of the faces of his men, wondering which one of them had sold his life for a mountain of silver. Finally, he picked up the keycard. The plastic felt heavy, warm from the desk's electronics. He didn't just hand it to her. He placed it in her palm and closed her fingers over it with his own. It was a silent pact, a surrender of his old self. The credentials for the primary hub are encrypted behind a biometric lock, he whispered, but that the master key will bypass the physical shutters in the server room. If you're going to do this, Kiara, you have to do it now. My security detail will be here in 20 minutes to escort me to the merger meeting. Kiara nodded, her grip tightening on the card. The silent observer was gone, replaced by a woman of action. I need a secure line and a clear path to the basement level of the headquarters. I can't go in the front door in this uniform. Tae-Won reached into his desk and pulled out a sleek, unmarked phone, his personal emergency line. There is a service entrance through the underground garage. My private elevator goes straight to the core. I'll divert the security cameras for a 5-minute window. He paused, looking at her one last time. The hierarchy finally and irrevocably broken. Kiara, if this goes wrong, I won't be able to protect you. A small, confident smile touched her lips, a flash of the tactical analyst who had once navigated war zones. Mr. Choi, I've been protecting myself long before I met you. Just make sure you look surprised when you see me in the boardroom. As she turned to leave, discarding the white headband on the desk like a relic of a past life, Tae-Won sat back in his chair. He was a man who had lost everything: his certainty, his pride, and his trust in his own world. But as he watched the woman in the maid's uniform disappear into the elevator, he felt a strange, terrifying spark of hope. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't fighting alone. The morning was coming, and with it, a war for his empire. But he had just handed the mastery to the only person who actually knew how to win it. As the elevator descended toward the subterranean levels of the building, the humming silence provided a rare moment for Kiara to breathe. In the reflection of the polished steel doors, she saw the maid's uniform, the black and white fabric that had been her camouflage for 2 long years. For Tae-Won, this night was the end of a world he had built. But for Kiara, it was the resurfacing of a world she had tried to bury in the red clay of Georgia. Years ago, Kiara hadn't been a ghost. She had been a rising star in the high-stakes world of private intelligence. In a windowless room in Virginia, she had been a tactical analyst for a firm that handled the secrets governments didn't want on their books. She was the one who could see the patterns in the chaos, the one who could find a needle in a digital haystack before the needle even knew it was lost. She had been proud, brilliant, and most dangerously principled. The turning point had come during a routine audit of a high-level defense contractor. Kiara had stumbled upon a backdoor, not a mistake left by a lazy coder, but a deliberate vulnerability designed to allow sensitive data to be siphoned off to an international arms conglomerate. She did what she had been trained to do. She reported it. But she quickly learned that in the world of true intelligence, the truth is often a liability. Within 48 hours, her security clearance revoked. Within a week, Principled found herself framed for the very breach she had discovered. Her bank accounts were frozen, her reputation was shredded in the whisper networks of DC, and the people she had called colleagues became the hunters. They didn't just want her fired. They wanted her erased. The trauma of that betrayal had left a scar deeper than any physical wound. It taught her that being seen was a death sentence. To survive, she had to become someone else somewhere else. She had used her remaining hidden resources to scrub her digital footprint and fled to South Korea, a place where her face stood out but her past was invisible. She had traded her tactical maps for floor plans and her high-level encryption keys for a mop and a spray bottle. In Seoul, she discovered a strange kind of peace in being overlooked. As a black woman working as domestic help in a high-powered household, society had already written a script for her. They expected her to be quiet, hardworking, and fundamentally unremarkable. She played the part to perfection. She learned to keep her head down and her ears open, listening to the secrets of the powerful as they spoke over her as if she were a piece of furniture. She had watched Choi Tae-Won for 2 years from that place of invisibility. She had seen the way his hands shook after a violent meeting, and the way he looked at the photograph of his daughter with a longing for a different life. She saw a man who was trapped in his own cage of power, just as she had been trapped in her cage of duty. Now, As she stepped out of the elevator and into the cool, sterile air of the server hub, Kiara felt the old weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. She wasn't just a maid anymore, but she wasn't that naive analyst from Virginia either. She was something new, a woman who had lived in the shadows long enough to know exactly how to strike from them. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the master Choi Tae-Won had given her. It felt cold against her palm. This wasn't just about stopping a hack or saving a billionaire's fortune. For Kiara, this was the first time in years she was choosing to be seen, not because she had to, but because she decided that some things, and some people, were worth the risk of coming out of exile. She approached the primary terminal, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in her eyes. The silent observer was gone. The strategist was back, and this time, she was playing by her own rules. The boardroom of the Choi group was a cavern of cold marble and high tensile glass, smelling of expensive espresso and the sharp metallic scent of anxiety. Outside, the Seoul morning was in full swing, but inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. 8 of Tae-Won's most powerful lieutenants sat around the perimeter, their faces grim, their eyes darting to the empty seat at the head of the table. They had spent the last 6 hours watching their personals cower like dying birds, and they were looking for someone to blame. When the heavy oak doors finally swung open, the room fell into a deafening silence. Tae-Won, his gait steady, his dark suit perfectly pressed as if the world hadn't nearly ended on his watch. But it wasn't his presence that caused the collective intake of breath. It was the woman walking half a step behind him. Kiara had traded her black and white uniform for a tailored charcoal blazer and slacks, her hair still in that neat, elegant updo, but her gaze was no longer fixed on the floor. She carried a sleek tablet in the crook of her arm, her expression a mask of quiet, unshakable confidence. To the men in the room, she was a ghost made flesh, a servant who had suddenly stepped out of the shadows and into the sunlight. Tae-Won didn't wait for them to sit. He reached the head of the table and placed his hands on the cool surface. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice a low rumble that commanded the room. "The crisis that began at midnight has been neutralized. Our assets are secure, and the merger will proceed as scheduled at 10 o'clock. A murmur of relief rippled through the table, but it was quickly cut. Park, the oldest and most traditional of the lieutenants. He glared at Kiara, his lip curling with a mixture of confusion and disdain. "And who is this, boss? Why is the help standing in a room where blood is sworn? This is a private meeting of the inner circle." Tae-Won's eyes narrowed, the dragon on his neck appearing to tighten. "This is Kiara Mitchell. As of 5 minutes ago, she is the chief tactical officer of the Choi group. She is my second in command for all matters regarding digital infrastructure and internal security. From this moment forward, her voice is my voice." The uproar was instantaneous. Chairs scraped against the floor as men stood in protest, their voices overlapping in a chaotic wave of disbelief. "She's a foreigner," one shouted. "She's a maid. I've seen her cleaning the hallways," another cried, his face reddening with insult. Park slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising above the rest. "This is a joke. Tae-Won, you're putting our lives in the hands of a woman who doesn't even share our history, a woman who was hired to scrub floors. Have you lost your mind in the stress of the night?" Tae-Won didn't shout. He didn't have to. He simply leaned forward until his face was inches from Park's. "While you were all at home watching your money vanish and waiting to tell you what to do, this woman was the only one standing in the line of fire. She stopped a zero-day exploit that none of your high-priced security teams even noticed. She didn't ask for permission, and she didn't ask for a bribe. She simply did what none of you could." He turned his gaze to the rest of the room, his eyes like flint. "Tradition didn't save us last night. Loyalty to a flag or a name didn't stop the hack. Intelligence did. And if any of you have a problem with her being in this room, you are more than welcome to leave your keys and your titles on this table before you walk out the door." The silence that followed was heavy and bitter. The lieutenants looked at one another, the power dynamic shifting in a way they weren't prepared for. Kiara hadn't said a word, but her presence felt like a physical weight in the room. She stood perfectly still, watching them with the same analytical gaze she had used on the red warning screens. She wasn't intimidated by their shouting. She was studying them, looking for the patterns of their descent, just as she had looked for the patterns in the code. Park slowly sat back down, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a resentment that promised future trouble. "Fine," he hissed. "She saved the servers. But being a second in command is about more than typing on a screen. It's about knowing who the enemies are." "I already know who the enemies are," Kiara said. Her voice was calm, cutting through the tension like a blade. It was the first time most of them had ever heard her speak, and the authority in her tone was jarring. "I've spent 2 years listening to you speak in the hallways when you thought I couldn't understand you. I know who is skimming from the Incheon accounts. And I know who has been meeting with Titan Systems representatives in secret." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The men who had been shouting suddenly found reasons to look at their notes or their watches. Tae-Won felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He had spent years ruling through fear and tradition, but Kiara was teaching him a new kind of power. The power of the person who has been watching while everyone else was talking. "Kiara has the floor," Tae-Won said, stepping back to give her the center of the room. "She is going to show you exactly how we are going to find the man who tried to kill us last night. And I suggest you listen closely, because by noon, the inner circle is going to be a lot smaller than it is right now." As Kiara stepped forward and activated the primary monitor, the lieutenants realized that the invisible woman had not been invited into their world. She had already conquered it. The dragon had a new shadow, and she was far more dangerous than the man she served. The blue light of the boardroom's massive monitors bathed the frozen faces of the lieutenants in a ghostly glow. Kiara stood at the center of the room, her fingers dancing across the interface of her tablet. She didn't look like the woman who had spent 2 years emptying their trash bins. She looked like a commander directing a surgical strike. Tae-Won sat slightly back, his arms crossed, watching the men he had called brothers with a newfound, terrifying clarity. "A zero-day exploit is like a thumbprint," Kiara began, her voice steady and clinical. "It requires a specific set of permissions and a very narrow window of opportunity. The person who triggered the lockout at 9 p.m. didn't just have a password. They had physical access to the server room's cooling subroutine." She swiped her finger across the tablet, and a comps map of the building's internal wiring appeared on the wall. A single red line began to pulse, tracing a path from the executive offices down to the basement. The attacker used a localized signal jammer to hide their movement from the primary security cameras. She continued, "But they forgot about the secondary atmospheric sensors. These sensors track heat signatures to adjust the air conditioning." The men at the table shifted uncomfortably. The tension was so thick it felt as though the oxygen was being sucked out of the room. Kiara tapped a specific point on the timeline. At 8:42 p.m., while the rest of you were at the charity gala, someone entered the server room. They spent exactly 4 minutes inside, just enough time to plug in a hardware bridge that allowed an external firm, Titan Systems, to bypass our encryption. Tae-Won's eyes swept the room, resting on each man like a predator deciding where to bite. "And who?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Does the sensor say was in that room?" Kiara looked up from her screen. She didn't look at Park, nor at the younger men who had been shouting earlier. Her gaze landed directly on a man, Minho, the quiet, meticulous head of logistics, who had wiped one side for over a decade. The heat signature matches a man of exactly 5'10", weighing approximately 180 pounds, Kiara said. But more importantly, the hardware bridge was activated using a specific biometric sequence. An iris scan. She swiped again. A high-resolution log appeared on the screen, showing the login credentials. The room went deathly silent. The name on the screen, in bright, unforgiving letters, was Minho. Minho's face didn't crumble into a mask of guilt. It hardened into a sneer of pure, cold hatred. Didn't try to deny it. He looked at Tae-Won, then at Kiara. A dry, hollow sound that echoed off the marble walls. "You found it," Minho spat, his voice devoid of its usual humility. "The maid found the ghost in the machine. But it doesn't matter, Tae-Won. Titan Systems already has the keys. They've promised me a seat at a table that doesn't require me bow to a man with a tattoo on his neck. You're a relic. A dinosaur waiting for the asteroid." Tae-Won didn't explode in rage as they expected. He stood up slowly, the silence in the room becoming heavier than the shouting had ever been. He walked toward Minho, his shoes clicking rhythmically on the floor. "You think they want you, Minho?" Tae-Won asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Tate doesn't buy partners, they buy tools. And once a tool has been used to betray its first owner, it's usually thrown away." He turned to Kiara, a silent question in his eyes. She understood. She tapped a final sequence on her tablet. "Minho thinks he succeeded," Kiara said to the room. "But as I told you, I redirected it into a dead-end server. The keys he gave Titan are nothing but a recursive loop. Every time they try to use one of those passwords, it sends a signal back to me, mapping their own internal servers. Right now, I am currently downloading Titan's entire list of offshore accounts and their roster of paid informants within the Seoul Police Department." The shift in the room was tectonic. Minho's sneer vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. He realized in that moment that he hadn't just failed his betrayal. He had led his new masters into a trap set by a woman he had never even looked at. "You're not just a maid," Minho whispered, his voice trembling. Kiara looked at him, her expression one of calm, detached pity. "I told you, Minho, people see what they want to see. You saw a servant. I saw a traitor who walked too heavy in the hallways." Tae-Won signaled at the door. As they moved to court Minho out, the rest of the lieutenants sat in stunned, fearful silence. They looked at Kiara Mitchell with a new kind of reverence, not the forced respect of a title, but the genuine fear of a person who holds the power of truth. The dragon had reclaimed his throne, but the room knew that the real fire was come the woman standing beside him. The betrayal had been decoded, but as Kiara closed the digital files and looked toward the window, she knew the war was far from over. Titan Systems wouldn't take this humiliation quietly, and now, she was no longer a shadow. She was a target. The tension in the penthouse had shifted from the frantic energy of a crisis to the cold, calculated stillness of a hunt. Min had been removed, but as Kiara pointed out while staring at the live data streams, he was merely the hand that flipped the switch. The true architect of the betrayal, the one within the inner circle who had coordinated with Titan Systems, was still sitting at the table, hiding behind a mask of righteous indignation. Tae-Won stood by the window, his reflection cutting through the morning haze of Seoul. He looked at Kiara, who was now seated at his mahogany desk, the master key resting beside her tablet. She wasn't looking at him, she was watching a series of blinking dots on a digital map. "They think they've won," Kiara said, her voice barely a whisper. "Titan Systems believes they have the corrupted logs. They'll realize it's a fake within the hour. If we want to catch the lead traitor, we have to give them something they can't resist. We have to give them the master handshake for the international merger." Tae-Won turned, his brow furrowed. "That's the heart of the company, Kiara. If that falls into their hands, there is no coming back." It's not the real handshake, Mr. Choi," a faint, dangerous spark in her eyes. "It's honeypot. A digital tracking beacon wrapped in the skin of a 10 billion merger. But for them to believe it's real, it has to be delivered by someone they trust. Someone who thinks they are finally finishing you off." Tae-Won understood the gamble. They weren't just setting a trap for a hacker. They were setting a trap for a human being's greed. He called for a second, emergency meeting of the remaining lieutenants. This time the atmosphere was different. There was no shouting, only a heavy, suspicious silence. Minho was a fool, Tae-Won told the men, his voice echoing with a forced wariness. But he was right about one thing. I am tired. The hack tonight proved that I can no longer protect this empire alone. I've decided to move the merger up by 4 hours. We sign at noon, or we don't sign at all. He leaned back, looking older than he had that morning. The final authorization codes are on this drive, he said, holding up a sleek silver USB. I cannot be the one to carry it to the secure terminal at the exchange. If I move, Titan's assassins will be on me. One of you must take it. One of you must be the bridge to our future. The room held its breath. This was the master key to the kingdom. Whoever held that drive held the power to either save the Choi group or sell it to the highest bidder. Park, the traditionalist who had been the most vocal against Kiara, reached out his hand. I will do it, boss. I have been with you since the beginning. You can trust no one but your own blood. But then, a younger man named Junho, the head of financial operations, stood up. He had been the quietest during the morning's uproar. Park is too high profile. Junho said smoothly. The police and Titan will be watching the elders. I can move through the city unnoticed. I am the one who handled the merger's preliminary audits. It makes sense for it to be me. Tae-Won looked at Kiara. She was standing in the corner holding a tablet, her face as impassive as a statue. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Junho is right, Tae-Won said, his voice heavy with feigned reluctance. Take the drive. The future of the dragon is in your hands. As Junho gripped the silver drive and hurried out of the room, the rest of the lieutenants dispersed, leaving Tae-Won and Kiara alone in the red-bathed office. The moment the click shut, the wariness vanished from Tae-Won's face. He moved to the monitors where Kiara was already typing. He bit, she said. On the screen, a small blue dot representing the US drive was already moving away from the building. But alongside it, hidden red signal was pulsing. GPS signature Kiara had embedded into the drive's casing. He's not heading toward the exchange, Tae-Won noted, his jaw tightening as he saw the turn toward the industrial district near the Han River. He's heading to a Titan Systems safe house, Kiara confirmed. He thinks he's carrying the keys to your kingdom. He doesn't realize that the moment he plugs that drive in, it won't just track his location. It will activate the cameras and microphones on whatever device he uses. He's about to give us a front row seat to his confession. Tae-Won looked at the woman who had been his maid just 24 hours ago. She had orchestrated a masterpiece of psychological and digital warfare. She hadn't just found the traitor, she was letting the traitor hang himself. You knew it was him, Tae-Won said. Junho was too quiet, Kiara replied, her eyes never leaving the map. In my experience, the person who says the usually the one doing the most. He didn't protest my promotion because he thought I was a temporary distraction. He thought I was a maid playing at being a soldier. The blue dot stopped at a warehouse near the docks. He's there, Kiara whispered. Tae-Won reached for his coat, the dragon tattoo on his neck seeming to pulse with anticipation. Then it's time to end this. Call the security teams. We're going to the docks. Kiara stood up, her tablet in hand. I've already alerted the tactical units, to Choi, and I've redirected the black book data to the safe house's local network. When the police arrive, they won't find your secrets. They'll find Junho standing over a mountain of evidence linking him and Titan Systems, every crime they tried to pin on you. As they walked toward the elevator, Tae-Won realized that he had spent his life afraid of the people who were visible. The rivals, the police, the rebels. He had never understood that the real power belonged to the one who could move through the world unseen. The trap set, the bait had been taken, and for the first time in his life, the boss was following the Maid into battle. The industrial docks of the Han River were shrouded in a thick, sulphurous fog that swallowed the moonlight. Inside the rusted skeleton of Warehouse 14, Junho with a smug grin, surrounded by 4 men in tactical gear mercenaries hired Titan Systems. He held the silver USB drive aloft like a trophy. Tae-Won is finished, he boasted to the man on the other end of a video link. I have the handshake. By the time he realizes the drive is a tracker, his empire will be a memory. Suddenly, the warehouse's high-pressure sodium lights flickered and died, plunging the space into a suffocating, absolute darkness. What happened to the power? Junho shouted, his voice cracking with the first hint of fear. Stay calm, the lead mercenary growled, clicking on a high-powered tactical flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, sweeping across of shipping crates. But the warehouse was silent until a calm, steady voice echoed from the rafters, seemingly coming from everywhere at once. You're right about the tracker, Junho. But you're wrong about who is in control. It was Kiara. Her voice didn't carry the panic of the hunted. It carried the cold, alert focus of a predator. One of the mercenaries spun toward the sound, but before he could raise his weapon, the warehouse's overhead crane groaned to life. A massive steel pallet swung out of the gloom, knocking the man off his feet and sending his rifle skittering across the concrete. She's in the system, Junho screamed, clutching the USB drive to his chest. Kill her. Find her and kill her. But Kiara wasn't just in the system, she was the system. From her tablet in the armored van outside, she was playing the warehouse like an instrument. She triggered the fire suppression system, and a blinding cloud of chemical foam erupted, masking her movement as she slipped through a side door, her silhouette lean and lethal in the mist. Tae-Won moved through the fog behind her, watching in awe. He had spent his life leading with a hammer, but Kiara was using a scalpel. She didn't engage in a firefight. She used the environment to dismantle the enemy's plan in real time. She hacked the mercenaries' encrypted comms, filling their pieces with a high-pitched, agonizing feedback loop that left them clutching their heads. Pain. I see you, Junho, Kiara whispered through the warehouse's PA system. Section 4B, behind the crates of electronics. You're holding a dead drive and a one-way ticket to a life sentence. Junho bolted toward the rear exit, but the heavy steel shutter slammed shut inches from his face. He turned, gasping, only to find himself bathed in the beam of a single, surviving spotlight. Standing at the edge of the light was Kiara. She had discarded the charcoal blazer, her white headband long gone, her sleeves rolled up to reveal a focus that was terrifyingly sharp. The lead mercenary, recovered and desperate, lunged at her with a combat knife. Kiara didn't flinch. With the economy of motion that only comes from years of high-level tactical training, she parried the strike, used the momentum to send him into a stack of pallets, and disarmed him before he hit the ground. Tae-Won stepped out of the shadows then, his presence filling the space with heavy gravity of the dragon. He looked at Junho, who was now trembling so violently the USB drive fell from his hand. You thought she was just a maid, Tae-Won said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. You thought I was weak because I trusted her. I can explain. Junho stammered, looking toward the dark corners for an escape that didn't exist. There is nothing to explain, Kiara said, stepping forward. She tapped her tablet one last time. Outside, the wail of sirens grew louder, not the local precinct, but the National Cybercrimes Task Force. The data on that drive didn't just track you, Junho. It broadcast your conversation with Titan Systems to every major news outlet in the city. You didn't just betray the boss, you confessed to the world. The standoff was over. The mercenaries lay groaning in the dark, and Junho to his knees. His face paled at the realization that he had been outplayed by the very person he had refused to see. Kiara stood beside Tae-Won, her breathing steady, her eyes reflecting the flashing blue and red lights of the arriving authorities. The Shadow Queen had reclaimed her throne, not in a windowless room in Virginia, but here, in the heart of a city that had tried to ignore her. Tae-Won looked at her, his hand brief touching the tattoo on his neck, a symbol of the old world. Then he looked at Kiara and gave a short, respectful nod. He wasn't the one who had saved Empire tonight. He was just the man lucky enough to have been standing next to the woman who did. The sirens had long since faded into the morning air, and the dust of the warehouse had settled, but the world that rose from the wreckage was entirely unrecognizable. 6 months later, the Choi Group was no longer whispered about in the dark corners of Seoul as a shadow empire. It had become the gold standard for global innovation. The transition hadn't been easy. It required a surgical extraction of the old guard and a complete dismantling of the boss that Tae-Won had worn like armor for over a decade. Tae-Won stood on the balcony of his new headquarters, a building designed not for isolation, but for transparency. He no longer wore the heavy, dark suits of a man hiding a dragon. Today, he wore a simple, light-colored blazer, the collar open to reveal that the tattoo was still there. Reminder of where he came from. But no longer a definition of where he was going. He watched the city below, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was looking at targets or tools. He was looking at a sea of possibilities. The doors behind him opened, and he didn't need to turn to know who it was. The rhythm of her step was no longer the cautious, quiet pace of a maid, but the steady, rhythmic stride of a partner. Kiara joined him at the railing, her hair styled in its signature elegant updo, her eyes reflecting the bright morning sun. She was the chief executive of the newly formed Mitchell Choi Foundation, a division of the company dedicated to finding invisible talent in the underserved neighborhoods of the world. The board just approved the expansion into Atlanta, Kiara said, a smile playing on her lips. They were hesitant at first, but once they saw the data on the talent pools we're tapping into, they couldn't say no. Tae-Won turned to her, his expression softened by a peace that would have been unimaginable a year ago. They couldn't say no because they've finally learned to trust the person behind the data. They've learned what I learned that in the penthouse, that the most valuable person in the room is often the one you've been trained to overlook. He reached and, his fingers interlacing with hers. Their partnership had grown into something far deeper than business. They were a miracle born of a crisis, a testament to what happens when pride is traded for humility, and when a shadow is finally given the light it deserves. Their wedding had been a quiet affair, far from the cameras and the gossip, attended only by those, not as a mafia boss and a maid, but as two people who had saved each other from their own versions of exile. I still remember the first day you walked into my office, Tae-Won said, looking back at the glass doors where his staff moved about, collaborating in an open-plan space that encouraged the very brilliance Kiara represented. I thought I was the one in control. I thought I had everything figured out. You were just waiting for a reason to change, Tae-Won, Kiara replied softly. You just needed someone to see the man under the ink. The Choi had been rebranded as the Horizon Legacy, a nod to the reference story that had guided their transformation. It was a company built on the principle that genius has no hierarchy, and that loyalty is earned through respect, not fear. They spent their days dismantling the old systems of corruption and replacing them with a legacy of transparency that shook the foundations of Seoul's corporate world. As they stood together, looking out over the city they were helping rebuild, the voice of the narrator seemed to echo in the wind, reminder to the world that our greatest blessings often come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. They were no longer the dragon and the ghost. They were the visionaries of a new empire, one where no one was invisible and everyone had a seat at the table. Tae-Won looked at Kiara, his wife and his equal, and realized that he hadn't just saved his company that night. He had saved his soul, and as they walked back inside, hand in hand, to start the day's work, it was clear that the story of the Korean boss and the black maid wasn't just a story about. It was a story about the kind of love and brilliance that changes the world in seconds. As they stood there, looking out over a city that was finally beginning to reflect their vision, it became clear the miracle wasn't the billions of dollars or the high-tech empire they had built. No, the real miracle was the moment a man with a dragon on his neck decided to truly look at the woman holding a mop. Tae-Won and Kiara spent the rest of their lives proving that when you stopping at titles and start looking at souls, you find the strength to change the world. They taught us that no one is truly invisible unless we choose not to see them, and that sometimes the person you think is your servant, the one destined to be your savior. As we leave the penthouse and the bright lights of Seoul behind, I want you to take a look around your own life. Who are the invisible people in your world? Who are you walking past every day without a second thought? Because the truth is, we are all just one moment away from needing a miracle, and we are all just one act of kindness away from being one for someone else. If this story of Choi Tae-Won and Kiara Mitchell touched your heart today, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep sharing these stories of hope and transformation with the world. And before you go, I have a question for you. Have you ever had a moment where someone you underestimated ended up being the person who saved the day? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And I love hearing where in the world you are watching from. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Remember, keep your eyes open and your heart humble, because your greatest blessing might be wrapped in the most unexpected package. I'll see you in the next story. God bless.